So this is interesting. Standing in front of this curtain, I feel like a college football coach in a post-game press conference or something. Like I want to say something like, yeah, we really brought our A game and stepped it up to the next level so we could give 110%, you know. And then the other team, they failed to bring their A game and they didn't really step it up to the next level or give 110%. So that's kind of where we're going. Feels interesting. And as Mark mentioned, I'm here to talk to you about production in the firm. So it's kind of a topic and a half. We'll talk about production. From that, we'll derive the theory of the firm, and I'm going to begin with a radical proposal. That which is going to be consumed must first be produced. So if you're going to consume anything, you first have to produce it. If I'm going to consume this glass of water, it must first be produced in some way. So the water has to be made drinkable. The glass has to be, the plastic, has to somehow be produced and delivered to the Mises Institute and all sorts of other wonderful things. So if we're going to consume anything, it first has to be produced. So we begin with a couple of very simple principles in the context of a very simple example. In order to develop a few things, we're going to develop the theory of capital, the theory of value, the theory of exchange, the theory of money, and finally we'll talk a bit about the theory of the firm. Okay, so Guido showed you guys a couple of maps the other night. I showed you a map of Austria, a map of Europe. This is a map of the island from the TV show Lost. Okay? So we might have someone who is lost on a desert island. Let's call that person Hurley. Okay, so we have someone who is lost on a desert island. Hurley is our hero who is lost on a desert island, and if Hurley is going to avoid death, as a guy who's lost on this desert island, he somehow needs to come up with sufficient calories, sufficient micronutrients, and sufficient shelter to basically take care of his person. Okay, so let's consider the production of food for just a second. So Hurley's not really going to be so good at catching fish, we'll say. Okay, Hurley not much of a fisherman, but he can pick 2 mangoes a day. Okay, he goes on for a little bit and finally decides, if he had a net, he could catch a fish every so often. And in order to produce this net, which would be in the Mengerian sense a higher order good, a capital good, as it were, he's going to have to save enough mangoes to sustain him while he's producing the net. So what is capital accumulation and what does it do? Capital accumulation, fundamentally, is the process of lengthening the structure of production. It's counterintuitive at first because we often think about capital being something that saves time. You don't buy capital goods because it'll take you longer to do something. You don't buy a lawnmower based on whether that lawnmower will make mowing the lawn take longer. When we talk about lengthening the structure of production, we mean lengthening the period of time from the commencement of a production process to the consumption of the final output. Okay, so if Hurley's just picking mangoes, he's living pretty much literally hand to mouth. He's climbing up, he's picking a mango, he's eating it. That's a relatively short structure of production. That's a relatively short production process. If he produces a net, or if he produces a capital good, he has to lengthen the structure of production, he has to take time, and he has to save resources to sustain him through the production of the capital good. He has to lengthen the structure of production. Okay? He discovers that if he fashions a net, he can actually catch a fish. He can catch maybe 1 fish a day. He couldn't do that with his bare hands, but with a net, Hurley can catch 1 fish per day. He'll need to save in order to nourish himself through this production process, and eventually he gets to the point where he can catch 1 fish or he can produce 2 mangoes in a day. Either or. He can catch a fish or he can pick 2 mangoes. He's probably not going to be very long for this world under those circumstances unless he accumulates additional capital, but we'll leave that as another discussion for another day. Okay? That's, in a nutshell, the theory of capital, or part of the theory of capital. Okay, now let's consider value. Notice the direction in which value is moving here. Okay? Value is not moving from the capital good to the output. Value is not moving from the cost of production to the value of the output. The sweat that Hurley's putting into the production of the net does not produce the value of the net. Rather, the value of the net is imputed backward from the value of the fish. Okay, so the value of the fish is what gives the net value. It's what gives Hurley's time value, and his willingness to wait is what would create, as Professor Murphy mentioned yesterday, that's what would create interest. His willingness to wait to delay consumption would create interest in a well-functioning economy. Okay? This is important. It's important for a lot of different reasons. Because when people think of value, in most discussions they don't think of it in these terms. They think about the physical and chemical characteristics of whatever it is that's being discussed. Or they think about labor as being a source of value. If you studied Karl Marx, or if you've studied 19th century socialism, labor was taken as sort of the theory of value. But then, of course, that begged the question, well, where does labor get its value? And we know that in a market economy, in this situation, value is imputed backward from final consumption to the capital goods that go into that production process. Okay. That's value. Let's talk about trade. Someone else shows up. Hurley goes on his merry way, and then he discovers that someone else is washed up on the island. Okay, Jin is a proficient fisherman and a proficient mango picker. Jin can catch 6 fish or pick 3 mangoes in a day. That's going to give Hurley and Jin production possibilities. Okay, Hurley can catch 1 fish or pick 2 mangoes in a day. Jin can catch 6 fish or pick 3 mangoes in a day. And what we're going to do here is we're going to develop a theory of exchange based on these differences in productivity. Okay? Given Hurley's production possibilities, the opportunity cost to Hurley of catching a fish is the 2 mangoes he could have picked otherwise. So, in order to catch a fish, he gives up the opportunity to pick 2 mangoes. Gita Holzman talked about this yesterday. In order to pick 1 mango, he gives up the opportunity to catch half a fish. Okay, that might seem somewhat unrealistic, but maybe he sets out the net one day and then the fish appears the next, or something to that effect. Okay? For Jin, for every fish he catches, he gives up the opportunity to pick half a mango. For every mango he picks, he gives up the opportunity to catch 2 fish. Okay? All right, so opportunity cost, this shows us some differences in productivity. And now what we're going to do is we're going to determine whether they can in fact actually gain from exchange. Okay? So at first glance, it appears that Hurley doesn't really bring a whole lot to the table. Jin is a fish catching and mango picking superstar. Okay? So what in the world could Jin, the fish catching, mango picking superstar uber stud, possibly have to gain from dealing with Hurley? Is he going to come in when Hurley sees him, is he going to come in and take all of Hurley's jobs, so to speak? Is he going to absorb all of the labor that Hurley could in fact be doing? Okay? Well, not necessarily. Because the law of comparative advantage is not determined necessarily by who's the biggest stud at fish catching and who's the biggest stud at mango picking, but who has the lowest opportunity cost. Hurley, in this case, has a lower opportunity cost for mango picking than does Jin. Jin, on the other hand, has a lower opportunity cost for fishing than does Hurley. Jin has a comparative advantage in fish. He only gives up half a mango for each fish, while Hurley would have to give up 2 mangoes for every fish. For Hurley, fishing is relatively costly. He gives up 2 mangoes for every fish that he catches, and for Jin, on the other hand, picking mangoes is costly because he gives up 2 fish for every mango that he picks. So suppose that one morning, they exchange pleasantries, and they're both sort of doing their own thing. They're operating in what we call autarky, which means they're not cooperating, they're not trading. Hurley offers Jin a mango in exchange for a fish. Is this a good deal or not? Let's consider. Okay? If Hurley catches a fish, it costs him the opportunity to pick 2 mangoes. Okay? If he can get a fish by only giving up 1 mango through trade, he's better off. Okay? Each fish is cheaper for Hurley if he's able to get them through trade. Instead of having to do without mangoes if he wants to eat fish, he can pick 2 mangoes, trade one of them for a fish, and he can have a mango and a fish. Okay? So fish are cheaper for Hurley if he's able to get them through trade. Therefore, this is a really good deal for Hurley. Okay? But of course, naturally, if Hurley's better off, then Jin has to lose, right? Okay? Well, not necessarily. Okay, so let's look at this. Let's look at this from Jin's perspective. Okay? For every mango that Jin picks himself, he would have to give up the opportunity to catch 2 fish. Okay? So therefore, if he can get a mango by only giving up 1 fish through trade, then he's clearly better off. So this is also going to be a good deal for Jin. Okay, so if they can agree to a mango price of fish that's between their opportunity costs, they can both make themselves better off. Okay? So an exchange economy has here been born by the addition of Jin to this economy and by the differences in their relative productivities. Okay? So Hurley should specialize relative to Jin in mango picking. Jin should specialize relative to Hurley in fish. They're both better off. It's a positive sum game. This is one of the fundamental principles of economics. Trade creates wealth. Okay? Trade creates wealth by allowing us to consume more than we would otherwise be able to get if we just did all of our own stuff ourselves. Okay? An exchange economy has been born. Okay? Let's suppose that, so we got Hurleys trading mangoes to Jin in exchange for fish. Suppose a third person shows up. Sawyer washes ashore with several cases of peanut butter. Okay? Just for whatever reason, he shows up in a raft, he's got peanut butter, he looks swarthy. Okay? And he's got all this peanut butter, he's wondering sort of what to do with it. Hurley would really like peanut butter. Yeah, Hurley likes peanut butter a lot. He'd like some peanut butter to go with his mangoes, some peanut butter to go with his fish, perhaps. Okay? He likes Thai food, maybe, so something to that effect. Okay, so he exploits his comparative advantage, and Hurley exploits his comparative advantage in mango production. Okay, and he shows up at Sawyer's tent, and he says, hey, Sawyer, I've got some mangoes I'll trade you for this peanut butter. Okay. Sawyer responds, okay, yeah, sorry, I'm allergic to mangoes. Okay, so Sawyer's allergic to mangoes. Hurley wants Sawyer's peanut butter. Perhaps we've reached an impasse. We have the problem of the mutual coincidence of wants that we have to somehow try to solve. Okay, and one way that we can get around this is, perhaps Hurley says, well, okay, I've got these mangoes that Sawyer doesn't want in exchange for peanut butter, but maybe what I can do is I can take some of the fish that I've been getting from Jin and I can trade that to Sawyer in exchange for peanut butter. So he says, okay, Sawyer, how about fish? Sawyer says, oh yeah, great, fish are wonderful. I'll trade you some peanut butter in exchange for fish. And we have the development now of a monetary economy. Okay? The development of a monetary economy in which fish are now serving the role of money. Because fish are taking not only a value in consumption, they're also taking value in exchange. Okay? Hurley wants fish not just because he likes fish, but he wants fish because he can use them to trade for peanut butter. Okay? I'll refer you to your notes on the money and banking lecture for reasons why fish will probably not emerge in long-run equilibrium as the monetary commodity. Okay? And if you're in one of my sessions during the exam at the end of the week, that's probably something that will be asked. Okay? All right. I'll just tell you now, if you can't explain why fish wouldn't be a very good money, then your chance of passing the exam may not be so great. All right. Okay, so we've got value, we've got money, we've got capital, we've got exchange. Another thing that tends to emerge as societies get more and more complex is they organize themselves into hierarchies. Okay, so the emergence of hierarchy is one of history's ultimate regularities. And hierarchy can take two forms. Hierarchy can be voluntary, or hierarchy can be involuntary. A voluntary hierarchy is a firm. Okay, so a firm is, some people define it as a nexus of contracts whereby people come together and engage in some production process via voluntary mechanisms. An involuntary hierarchy is a state. Okay? A state is where someone with a comparative advantage in violence comes along and says, that's a technical term. Incidentally, I worked with Douglas North at WashU, and I teach his book when I teach economic history, and he defines a state as an organization with a comparative advantage in violence extending over a geographic area with boundaries that are determined by its powers to tax constituents. Okay? Which basically means a state has a comparative advantage in violence, and they're the guys who can stick a knife in your gut if you don't pay up when they come around asking for taxes. Okay? All right. So we'll leave the analysis of involuntary hierarchies over the course of the rest of the week, and we'll talk about the economics of voluntary hierarchy over the next little bit. Okay. So voluntary hierarchy poses an interesting problem. Why do we have firms? The theory of the firm tries to explain a couple of things. It tries to explain why firms exist, what determines firm boundaries, and how and why firms organize themselves internally. It's not immediately apparent from some of the principles we've developed that complex activity should result in the organization of individuals and the organization of actions into firms. I believe it was Dennis Robertson, I think, who said that like lumps of butter coagulating on the top of milk. You know, economists were much more colorful in the 20s and 30s than they are today. You know, today we define a firm as, you know, a production vector such that conditions A, B, C, and D are fulfilled. And if condition D prime isn't filled, then we need antitrust or something like that. Okay. Okay. So it's not immediately apparent why firms organize themselves into, or excuse me, why people organize themselves into firms, why they organize themselves into voluntary hierarchies, why in this massive array of human action that emerges in a complex society, why we get Apple. Okay. Because, well, there are a handful of explanations. One is comparative advantage, or opportunity cost, okay, or economies of scale. All of these different explanations saying, well, people can take advantage of economies of scale, or specialization, or whatever, if they organize themselves into firms. But that's not necessarily the case, okay, because people can contract. You know, if I want something done for me, I can just pay someone to do it. Okay, it's not immediately clear to me, it's not immediately clear to anyone really, that we need to organize ourselves into a hierarchy whereby you agree to take orders from me, okay, and whereby I agree to pay you to take those orders. Okay. Eventually someone kind of hit on something, and this is the explanation to which I am most sympathetic. Ronald Coase, a name that you might have heard, and a name that you'll probably hear, that you should hear if you study economics, he asked, if markets are so great, why is it that we organize ourselves into these tiny little socialist organizations, or these tiny little socialist economies? Okay, because when you get down to it, like we said, trade creates wealth, prices reveal information, okay? Prices allow for rational economic calculation, so what a firm is basically people getting together and voluntarily deciding to forsake market exchange in order to organize production. Okay? So they're saying we're going to forego trade in the market. You're going to agree to take orders from me. I'm going to agree to give orders to you. Okay? We're not actually going to trade, so we're going to forsake this information revealing mechanism. Coase says, well, if markets are so great, why is it that people actually do this? Okay, his answer was the cost of transacting. Transaction costs, okay, according to Coase, are the reason why we have firms. Reason for this, okay, is because contracting is itself costly. Okay? You can't just go out and say, okay, I need this, all right, I need something done. I need something typed, I need something written, I need something designed, I need a PowerPoint presentation done, I need a lecture given, and have someone instantaneously come to you and say, I will do it. Okay? Contracting is itself costly. Okay? Coase's explanation is the explanation, again, to which I'm most sympathetic. Hierarchy, voluntary hierarchy, can economize on the cost of using the marketplace. Okay? These costs are the cost of transacting. They're the cost of measuring the valuable attributes of goods and services. Okay? And they're the cost of specifying and enforcing contracts. The organization of a firm allows you to reduce the costs that would be associated with continuous contracting to get done the things that you want done, to exploit economies of scale, etc., etc. All of these wonderful other reasons for why we think we have firms. Okay? So it's less costly to organize a firm than it would be to do everything through the marketplace, than it would be to do everything through exchange. Okay? So what are the limits to firm size? We know that firms forsake the market because they can economize on the cost of trade. They can economize on the cost of the exchange process. We want to know now, well, what is it that determines how big firms get? The explanation for why we have firms, the cost of transacting, also shows us those firms' limitations. Or it shows us the limitations on the size of the firm, and it shows us the limitations on the decisions that the firms will ultimately make. One of the really interesting things about academia is you can build a fairly nice career by studying one company. Okay? And for me, in the last couple of years, that one company has been Walmart. I do a lot of research on the economic history of the South, and I've also done a lot of research on Walmart. So let's talk a little bit about Walmart. Okay? Walmart is referred to by some as the beast from Bentonville. Okay? It's the destroyer of small towns. Okay? We'll evaluate all of that later. Okay? Walmart does one thing very, very, very well. They move goods from point A to point B, from one side of the world to the other, at rock bottom cost. They deliver everyday low prices. They deliver stuff very, very cheaply to wherever it is you want to be. I bought some t-shirts at Walmart this morning, a pack of 5 t-shirts for $8. 5 cotton t-shirts for $8. If I tried to produce a cotton t-shirt myself, I guarantee you it would be of much lower quality, and most certainly each individual shirt would probably cost more than $8. A bit of digression here on this. So my wife and I grow tomatoes every so often. We live in Memphis, and relatively reasonable tomato growing climate. A couple of years ago, I calculated that we're probably coming in at about $30 a tomato in terms of our opportunity cost, in terms of the cost that we're incurring in order to produce those tomatoes. But they taste a whole lot better than the stuff you get at the store. And they bloody well better taste a whole lot better than what you can get at the store if we're devoting $30 worth of resources per tomato to their production. Okay. So Walmart manages a global supply chain that moves goods and information around the world with almost unparalleled efficiency. They have a satellite in geosynchronous orbit around Bentonville, Arkansas, such that they know what's going where, when it's going, and they have probably the best data collection technology, the best set of retail data that has ever been assembled. Okay. It's only half the story, though. The suits in Bentonville, Arkansas cannot have the local knowledge that they would need in order to micromanage the daily operations of the Super Walmart in New Haven, Connecticut that my wife and I stopped at a couple of days ago. Okay, so I was collecting some data on Walmart, collecting some data on Sam's Club, and I noticed there's some things at the Super Walmart in New Haven, Connecticut that we don't have at our Super Walmart in Memphis, and some things that we have at our Super Walmart in Memphis that they don't have in New Haven, Connecticut. Okay, and if you're some guy in an office in Bentonville, Arkansas, odds are you don't know necessarily what local market conditions are always going to be like in New Haven, Connecticut, or in Los Angeles, California, or in any of the other places where Walmart does business. Okay? Walmart gives their managers and associates relatively wide latitude with respect to product, place, promotion, and price. So if you've ever taken a marketing class, you've probably heard those 4 terms. You can decide what's on special at times. You have a lot of latitude over the placement of your products, and then corporate, quote unquote, does really, really well at just moving products. Basically just moving products around. Okay? Walmart has been less successful in some other places because their ability to exploit local knowledge within the firm is and can be extremely limited. So particularly as they've expanded overseas, they've run into a lot of trouble. C.K. Prahalad has a really great book called The Fortune at the Bottom of the Pyramid, okay, where he talks about ingenuity among the world's global poor, preferences among the world's global poor, and how firms in developing countries are able to succeed where companies like Walmart and others have failed because they have access to local knowledge that these firms that these big multinationals can't quite exploit. Okay, so some of Walmart's overseas operations consist of joint partnerships with firms that have local knowledge but not Walmart's logistics expertise. So a question I ask my Econ 101 students: when will Walmart take over the world? Okay, what do you think?
Never.
Never. Okay, all right, so we have an answer of never for when Walmart will take over the world. When will the world be run by one giant firm? Okay? Because they can constantly exploit economies of scale. They can keep producing. Walmart will say can keep driving out little competitors by driving down cost and driving down cost and driving down cost, and then eventually Walmart is going to be the only company. Okay? What's wrong with that story?
You can make a hell of a lot of money just setting up stores and getting to buy them. They run out of money eventually.
Okay, so you can make a lot of money by just setting up stores and having Walmart buy you out. Okay, there's an episode of The Simpsons that speaks to that in the context of Microsoft. Okay, it involves Bill Gates showing up with a couple of thugs to trash Homer Simpson's home office. Okay, look for it on YouTube. All right. Okay, so that's one problem with the story. Well, let's consider. So we got Walmart kind of up here. It's this little tiny company in Bentonville, Arkansas, in the 1960s, and they do some things very, very well. Very, very low prices. So they grow. Walmart gets bigger. Okay? And they earn even more profits. There's an online map you should check out. Someone, as a graduate student somewhere, I cannot for the life of me remember his name, but he has a map that shows the growth of Walmart over time. It's really quite impressive. Okay? But Walmart gets bigger. They get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they keep growing. They're profitable. They're wonderful. You know, they're earning profits and they're making money and they're growing. And so, Sam Walton's on the cover of Fortune or something like that, and they keep getting bigger. And well, one thing that we notice here is that as they get bigger, the resolution on the logo picture here is starting to get a little bit grainier and a little bit grainier. Why is that? Because they're trading off the efficiencies that they're getting from larger scale for an increased knowledge problem. So let's think about that for a second. As a firm grows, it economizes on the cost of contracting in the marketplace. Okay, so these are external transaction costs. Okay? But this increases the costs that the firm will incur because their ability to engage in rational economic calculation is limited by the fact that there are no prices for goods that are not traded in markets. These are internal transaction costs. Okay? Firms that do a lot of things in-house can use the prices generated by the market to calculate, but in the limit, this problem gets worse and worse as the firm gets bigger and bigger. Okay, so you know that quote-unquote unskilled labor is traded in a relatively competitive market. Okay, so you can observe market prices for unskilled labor. You can observe market prices for trucks. You can observe market prices for tires. You can observe market prices for computers, for paper, and things like this. So this allows you to calculate to a certain degree, but as a firm gets bigger and as it brings more and more production in-house, as it brings more and more of the firm's operations inside the firm, okay, then it faces an ever-increasing knowledge problem. Okay? So eventually, the world will never be run by one giant firm because, again, as we notice, we get bigger, the resolution decreases, the decisions that they're making get fuzzier and fuzzier and fuzzier, okay? And eventually the company just gets too unwieldy. The reason why the world will never be run by one giant firm is because it'll run into exactly the same problem that a socialist government runs into. Prices are necessary for rational economic calculation. And if there is no market for your inputs and no market for your outputs, there can be no prices. Therefore, there can be no rational economic calculation. Okay? So if Walmart is the only firm, if they're the only seller of output, the only buyer of labor, the only buyer of capital, they have no way to value the inputs, no way to engage in rational economic calculation, and no way to know whether they're using resources effectively. How many of you have seen Wall-E? Okay. All right, so a lot of people have seen Wall-E. Okay. There's a firm in Wall-E called By and Large, okay, which I think is a very clever name, By and Large. Okay. It's a sort of a send-up, I think, of Walmart, and it shows kind of the anti-capitalist nightmare that eventually, you know, Walmart or By and Large gets so big that they effectively run the show. The problem, and this bugged me all through the whole time while I was sitting through Wall-E, is, well, you've got this one firm problem, you've got this socialist economy problem. How does By and Large engage in rational economic calculation? Okay? This is why I'm a lot of fun at parties. Okay? Is because I ask questions like this. Okay? I also do weddings and bar mitzvahs. All right. So let's consider, how is it that a firm decides how big to get? Okay? How do firms decide how big to get? How do firms decide whether they've chosen wisely or not? How does a firm know whether it's using resources economically, or how does a firm know that it's wasting resources? What tells them whether they're making good decisions? A priori, we can form expectations, but we can't know whether a firm is creating value. We cannot know whether a production process is going to create value a priori. A posteriori, after the fact, profits and losses tell us whether we're choosing wisely. When we earn profits, we're using resources to produce outputs that better satisfy other people's wants and needs than they would in other lines of employment. Okay? When we're earning losses, we're using resources to produce outputs that are less valuable than the resources would be in other lines of employment. In a well-functioning market economy, resource-wasting firms will get slapped around by the invisible hand, and the losses they earn will tell them that their skills are better used elsewhere. So let's consider an example. Imagine, if you will, so I've been walking around Auburn for a couple of days. And I've noticed there's a niche, I think, that can be filled. There's a hole in the marketplace in Auburn. That hole is for sour cream, sauerkraut, and salmon smoothies. I've noticed no one in Auburn is selling sour cream, sauerkraut, and salmon smoothies. I think it can be done. Okay? Now, what would you expect to happen if I were to open a store and say, hey, you know, Carden sour cream, sauerkraut, and salmon smoothies? Appetizing, right? Okay. What's that? Someone would try one, okay. That's got bar bet written all over it. All right. Okay, so we would guess, and most people would probably infer, that if I'm using sour cream, sauerkraut, and salmon to produce smoothies, this is probably going to earn losses. Okay, people are not going to buy these, or they might try them. Or again, like I said, they might do it on a dare, or something to that effect. But the market signal from these losses is going to be, hey, doofus, you're using the sauerkraut, you're using the sour cream, you're using the salmon to produce these smoothies that no one wants to buy. This is all more valuable elsewhere. You should put the sour cream on a potato or something like that. It's more valuable in that employment. The sauerkraut is more valuable in bratwurst. The salmon is more valuable in anything other than a smoothie. Okay? So the well-functioning market process will tell us that, hey, you need to go do something else, okay? Not produce smoothies, not be an entrepreneur, okay? Quit wasting our valuable resources. Okay? And that's the built-in mechanism that tells firms that they are using resources wisely or perhaps using resources poorly. Okay? Fortunately, as we've been told recently, all the firms that have received bailout money, GM and Chrysler included, we can rest comfortably in knowing that no political considerations will go into any of the decisions that they make, okay? And that they will respond as if they're responding to the profit-maximizing considerations that they would have as entrepreneurs. Okay, now let's suppose that I'm producing something that people really, really like, that people really like a lot. I'm producing pizza. People like pizza. Yay, yeah, pizza's good. Barbecue pizza, something we eat in Memphis. Barbecue nachos, we eat in Memphis. I didn't know until I moved to Memphis that someone made barbecue nachos. Okay, these things are amazing. Great taste that tastes great together. Okay. Now, one would observe a firm producing barbecue nachos or barbecue pizza and observe this firm earning profits. In the long run, this is going to attract entry, and all profitable opportunities are going to get competed away. Okay? So the market is going to send the signals that tell people what to produce, how to produce it, where to produce it, when to produce it, and the manner in which they can produce it that will create the most value for society. Okay? Profits attract entry in the very long run. All factors of production will earn the discounted present value of their marginal revenue product. Okay? Discounted present value of their marginal revenue product. Okay? Say that 10 times fast. Okay, which basically means that you'll be paid according to what you can produce. Capitalists will earn interest that reward them for foregone consumption, and in the long run, we will have no economic profits. Okay? So the market has built-in mechanisms that tell firms and individuals whether they're using resources wisely, whether they're using resources poorly, and in the long run, resources will be used in a way that produces the most value possible. Okay. So let's close with a couple of thoughts on firm boundaries, the extent of the market, and the relationship between regulation and the knowledge problem. Okay. The knowledge problem. So Joseph Salerno gave you a lecture earlier today on the socialist calculation debate. This, I think, so Mises's contribution to the socialist calculation debate, and then Hayek's 1945 paper on the use of knowledge in society, I think sort of looking into the very, very long run, I think and I hope that these may be viewed for the 21st century as two of the most fundamental contributions to economic science that have ever been made, because they force people to ask a very, very, very important question. How do you know? Okay? And the short answer is that in the absence of private property, in the absence of a well-functioning price mechanism, generally we don't. Okay, so presumably, we have government regulation in order to prevent concentration in certain markets, but we want to ask, well, what are the relevant markets? A couple of years ago, Pete Boettke and Peter Leeson wrote an article in which on the transition out of socialism, in which they asked, is the transition to the market too important to be left to the market? Okay? In the same spirit, I will ask, is the definition of the market too important to be left to the market? So can the market decide what the boundaries of the market actually are? Unsurprisingly, I would answer yes. Okay? Why? Because the market process itself reveals the information that will be necessary for the regulators to regulate rationally. Regulation, intervention, subverts the market process and in many cases destroys the very information that would be needed for well-functioning, well-meaning regulators to regulate in the first place. Okay, so it renders these types of decisions potentially arbitrary. As James Buchanan once argued, order is defined in the process of its emergence, and in the same way, markets are themselves defined in the process of their emergence. There are a couple of specific examples here. I read this morning that antitrust authorities have their sights set on Google. So the antitrust authorities are going to go after Google. I've seen it suggested that antitrust authorities should go after Apple because they dominate the market for MP3 players. They dominate the market for iPhones and iPhone substitutes. And I've written a Mises article on, a couple of summers ago, the debate over whether Whole Foods Market and Wild Oats Market should be allowed to merge. Okay? They've attracted scrutiny from federal regulators because they control disproportionate shares of certain markets. Now, why would I put control in scare quotes? Okay, well, it's not true. Okay, yeah, so I might put it in scare quotes because it's not necessarily true. If you're going to control someone, then presumably you have the power to direct their actions, to direct them to do things they wouldn't otherwise do. Okay, Whole Foods Market does not control me because I live 2 blocks from Kroger. They can't come to my house with guns and say, thou shalt go and shop at Whole Foods Market. Okay? Google does not control me because I can use Yahoo, I can use Bing. Apple does not control me because I can use fine products from Microsoft and other firms. I made the Mac switch last summer. We can talk about that later. Okay? All right. So these are markets. One of the things that interests me about these cases against Google, Apple, and Whole Foods Market is the markets are talking about are markets for stuff that didn't exist not that long ago. I just turned 30 in March, and I noticed that my students who come in 18, 19 years old, they've had access to things like I didn't have till graduate school. I didn't get my first cell phone until my first year of graduate school. I didn't get my first laptop until my 3rd year of graduate school, and so on and so forth. My first vehicle was a Brontosaurus. They have all of this great stuff that didn't exist many, many moons ago back when I was in that situation. Okay, so when the Whole Foods and Wild Oats Market merger was being scrutinized, the authorities, the Federal Trade Commission, claimed that this would create undue market power in the market for, and I quote, premium natural and organic supermarkets, end quote. So I did what any good economist would do. I said, well, what exactly are premium natural and organic supermarkets? Let's go to the North American Industrial Classification System, which is how we define firm boundaries, and see what is the 4-firm concentration ratio or the 8-firm concentration ratio in the, quote, premium natural and organic supermarkets, end quote, NAICS classification. Okay? I couldn't find such a category in the sort of standard data set by which we classify which industries are which. Okay, so literally the case against this merger was supported by claims that were just making stuff up. Okay, so the Federal Trade Commission is saying we're going to just make up an industrial category and claim that it's going to be controlled by this entity that is Whole Foods Market or Whole Paycheck Market, as some people have called it. Okay, and we'll cook up some rationale for regulation, some rationale for intervention, some reason why we should be able to stop this merger. Okay? So we have a handful of simple principles: action, choice, and scarcity. These give us a relatively simple theory of production, which in turn produces a theory of complex organization in a free society. Furthermore, it's a simple and obvious system of natural liberty, simple and obvious system of natural liberty, a nice quote from our good friend Adam Smith, okay, that produces the knowledge people need in order to engage in rational economic calculation. Okay? So if we observe Whole Foods Market earning massive profits in the natural and organic premium supermarket, or excuse me, premium natural and organic supermarket sector, then what should we do? Well, we observe their profits, we go and we compete with them. We produce our own premium natural and organic foods. Our local Kroger does this. Okay? Their profits generate knowledge. The profits that Whole Foods Market earns, the profits that Apple earns, the profits that Google earns says, hey, you are creating value. You are taking resources and you're turning them into something that people like more than they would if this stuff was used in some other way. Okay? This then is going to naturally draw firms into these markets. It's going to draw competitors, and furthermore, it's going to encourage innovation. Okay? So ultimately, attempts to regulate, attempts to define firm boundaries, and attempts to tell firms that they have too much market power are going to prove themselves redundant. Mark mentioned that several years ago I was in y'all's position as a student here at Mises U, and I remember Tom DiLorenzo saying something that has stuck with me. And every time I've talked about the theory of the firm, I've brought this up. Okay, so we can say, well, we want to determine how much market power there is in a given industry. Okay, and we can calculate a 4-firm concentration ratio, or we can calculate this, we can calculate price-cost margins, we can calculate all of this stuff. Implicit in this, as Professor DiLorenzo mentions, is the assumption that the market was in long-run equilibrium on the day the data were collected. It might just so happen that the market in question is in long-run equilibrium on the day that the data were collected. That's a rather heroic assumption about the way the market process operates, and a rather heroic assumption about the array of knowledge that's available to the regulators. Okay. So the process itself generates the knowledge that tells us whether we're creating value or whether we are not. Okay. So apart from the information that is generated by the market process, we cannot know how firms should be organized, we cannot know how firms should be regulated, and we cannot know when firms are too big or too big to fail. Okay? So those are a couple of thoughts on production, on the firm, and on the market process. So I've got a couple of minutes. I'd be happy to take any questions and have a little bit of discussion.
What do you feel about shirking costs? Is that Alshin and Demsetz?
Okay, so how do I feel about shirking costs?
As far as a theory of the firm or reason for firms to exist.
So how do I feel about the cost of shirking? So more generally, the cost of monitoring. Okay, so this might be one reason why firms exist. Okay, like I mentioned, firms economize on internal transaction costs, and if you're going to contract with somebody, then it might be difficult to get them to actually fulfill their end of the bargain. So you say, all right, I'll pay you to mow my grass. Or rather, something that's usually done inside firms, I will pay you to make photocopies for me. And then you take my money and you just don't do it. Or I will pay you to do these spreadsheets. Or I will pay you to do these analyses. And then you either don't do it or you do it rather poorly. What the firm can do is we can contract into a hierarchy whereby you agree to take orders from me and whereby you agree to be monitored by me, and I then evaluate your performance periodically. Okay, and then this then increases the cost to you of shirking and might reduce the cost to me of being taken advantage of in some type of bargain. So I would say that's consistent with the transaction cost view of the firm, basically. Yeah. Okay, so could you just structure the contract in such a way so that you only pay after the bargain has been fulfilled? Yeah, you could, but in some cases it might be costly to measure the output. Okay, so that might be another reason. Yeah. Sure.
I have a thought. If you have licensing within certain countries,
Mm-hmm.
it says you have to get this license to start firm, it creates extra costs.
Mm-hmm.
Could this actually create a distortionary effect on economic calculation in that sense? broad effect on the entire economy and industrial organization.
Okay. Okay, so question one, could licensing create distortion? Okay, yes. The first way obviously is by creating rents for the firms that are in the licensed industry, and by creating deadweight loss as a result of the fact that we don't get as much output as we otherwise would. Okay, now in terms of how that distorts economic calculation, there are a couple of things that are going on here. One thing that we've noticed, you might have seen that Walmart signed onto a letter saying, hey, we need to have this employer health care mandate. In 2005, Walmart said, hey, we need to increase the minimum wage. A blogger and journalist for the New York Times had a post last week saying, hey, look at all these businesses that have signed this petition saying, hey, we need to increase the minimum wage. Isn't this inconsistent with what we learned in Econ 101? Because businesses should have some form of solidarity because they have class interest or something to that effect. Look at these people who are an exception to what Econ 101 would predict. Okay? I would argue this is in fact actually exactly what Econ 101 predicts in the face of political incentives, in the face of incentives to compete by trying to kneecap your competitors via the legislative process. So implications of that would be net distortion in economic calculation, diversion of resources toward political competition, and actually larger firms. Okay, because if you increase the fixed cost of starting a firm, then this is going to make smaller firms relatively less profitable, larger firms relatively more profitable. Okay, and second question.
This kind of market regulation, it made me think of some things. I remember seeing a piece in the news in the UK a while back, and it was about some sort of legislation the government put in. Because what suppliers were actually doing was they were upset that distributors, I think it was for milk, they were charging too high prices. So they themselves started discriminating amongst distributors because they felt that the prices were unfair on the consumer. I mean, could this be a valid form of market regulation?
Okay, well, I'm not sure if I understand. So how are they discriminating?
Well, if let's say a supermarket was charging higher prices and the suppliers felt they should instead go to another one because they were paying the same amount for each anyway, they would supply more to the lower price.
Okay.
I think there was some sort of legislation in the UK that actually stopped suppliers from being able to do this.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. That's an interesting question. So the idea is can legislation prevent firms from seeking cheaper suppliers? Can legislation prevent firms from going elsewhere when they're getting quote unquote gouged for their product? The short answer is yes. Regulation of distribution in the United States is very, very interesting. For example, you have to have certain licenses to be able to distribute products in some areas. So again, Professor DiLorenzo mentioned in his lecture earlier that I think in the 1970s there were something like 25 brands of beer in the U.S. Okay? And one of the reasons why there weren't more brands of beer in the U.S. in the 1970s was the way that liquor distribution was regulated. That actually opens an interesting can of worms that would provide a lot of great dissertation topics for people who are interested in the studying economics at the graduate level. Okay. Other questions? Yeah?
Now, if regulations can lead to larger firms by virtue of raising, couldn't they actually raise the transaction cost of contracting in the market and in some ways hamper the ability for people to be self-employed and thus force them to join firms because the options of being a private single owner is foregone?
Okay. So would regulation reduce self-employment? A priori, I would say probably so, just because clearing the hurdles associated with getting all the licenses and things like that you need in order to open your own firm would be so costly that a lot of people just say, okay, yeah, forget it. I'm going to go work for Walmart, or I'm going to go work for Target, or I'm going to go work for Mega Global Evil Corp or something like that. Okay. Reminds me, another great book everybody should read is Hernando de Soto's book, The Mystery of Capital. Why capitalism succeeds in the West and, quote, fails everywhere else. Okay? De Soto and a bunch of his and members of his research team in Peru said, well, let's see what it costs to open a firm, to open a shirt factory in the United States or a shirt factory in Canada, and let's see what it would cost to open a shirt factory in Peru. Okay, so I'm just going to make up numbers here because I don't remember off the top of my head. But I think in the United States, it took a couple of days. You know, you get a few things signed, you pay a couple of fees, and so on and so forth. In Peru, it took years. Or I think it took years. Might have taken 289 days or something like that. In some places, it did, in fact, take years, numerous signatures, and there were some situations in which, even though they said we're not going to pay bribes, they actually had to bribe people because otherwise the entire process would stop. Okay, this is one reason why firms in some places like that might tend to be much larger, and why a lot of economic activity in relatively poor countries takes place underground. Okay. Second point.
And also, because of the foregoing option of sole proprietorship, couldn't it lead to firms being able to charge them, give them lower wages because of opportunity costs and they have less options?
Okay. Could it? Okay. So could foreclosing private or individual self-employment result in lower wages? Again, a priori, I would say yes, because if you make the next best opportunity illegal, then that might give you some market power in the labor market. Okay, so let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yes, you say that Walmart could never take over the world because if they get too big, they will run into calculation problems. But wouldn't that also be the case for potential competitors? They won't be able to calculate, so they won't have any advantage over Walmart, so they could not emerge because they don't even have synergies. So Walmart could take over the world, even if it was efficient.
Okay, so could Walmart take over the world even if it were inefficient because smaller firms wouldn't be able to compete because they run into the same calculation problems? Okay, I would say, one, let me qualify the claim. So Walmart could take over the world if they hired an army and, ran roughshod over everybody. So yes, there's probably some conceivable world in which Walmart decides to become a coercive entity, which, given some of the recent activity, may not be too far-fetched. We're going to assume that they don't do that, though. The problem is that the knowledge problem. The degree to which the knowledge problem matters is an increasing function of the firm's size. Okay, so smaller firms are not going to run into the same kinds of knowledge problems that firms like Walmart will run into. And when we talk about whether firm A, firm B, firm C is going to take over the world, this has kind of a boy that cried wolf sort of feel to it, because people have said this over and over and over again about all of these enormous firms that are going to take over the world. They're going to do whatever evil, terrible, horrible thing. So as much as people hate Walmart now, Don Boudreaux at George Mason has what I think is an interesting hypothesis and one that I agree with. He thinks that someday Walmart is going to get put out of business. And almost certainly Walmart will be creatively destroyed. Okay? And people, various commentators and whatnot will say, oh, look at the tragic death of this American institution that gave us all of this wonderful stuff, that gave us one-stop shopping, that gave us, this and that and the other thing. Oh, I remember, the essence of my childhood was going to Walmart, and being able to go buy, Little Debbie's, and then just walk across the store and get like sporting goods and T-shirts with cute slogans on them. We've lost a piece of Americana. Okay, as much as people hate Walmart today, Don Boudreaux thinks that's what's eventually going to happen, and I'd have to say I probably agree with him. So, okay. 2.
Do you think heavy labor laws may have an effect on the scope and the size of enterprises?
Sorry, heavy what?
Laws on labor,
oh.
For example, minimum wage or
okay.
things like that.
Yes, definitely. Okay, so does heavy regulation of the labor market have an effect on firm size? Okay, again, I don't know what the data says, but I would expect to see exactly that. So I'd say one thing that is made. So like I said, I don't have any particular fetish for Walmart. It's just that I studied the company and have written a lot of papers about it. So we'll continue with that. We'll continue with that example. I think one of the reasons why Walmart is as big as it is because of increasing regulations in labor markets in certain places. So one of the pathologies of regulation is that firms like Walmart can specialize, and develop a comparative advantage in dealing with regulatory infrastructure. Okay, so Walmart's got an army of lawyers who can navigate all sorts of who can navigate regulatory infrastructure at the federal level, at state levels, in all sorts of other places. Mom and pop's grocery shop may not. Okay, so if Walmart can develop a competency in dealing with labor market regulations and dealing with product market regulations and things like that, then that should increase firm size. And again, I think that would be those of you again who are looking for dissertation topics. I think that would be a good one. So, okay, 3.
I just wanted to actually add on something Abby said about the regulations. That was interesting. I'm from Minneapolis, and recently, I think it was about a year ago, Mattel was supporting this whole fine thing about big business. So trying to get conscious. They were supporting a big lead ban.
Mm-hmm.
And the lead ban happened. I think some kid swallowed a tiny lead toy, one free case, and of course they all started crying to Congress and say, we need to do this. And Mattel was basically. All these companies were saying, this is going to put us out of business. We can't afford the $200,000 to get this testing on our own. And of course, Mattel, who said, yes, we support this testing. We need to be responsible. And a lot of the left columnists are basically saying, oh, look at them. All of a sudden, they got conscious. And yet, I know locally in Minneapolis, a lot of small business toy producers were actually put out of business because of that. And it's funny, the same thing with Walmart supporting the healthcare stuff.
Yep.
I mean, they can easily pay for that. Small ones can't.
So that's an interesting point about why large firms would want to be regulated. And again, Professor DiLorenzo talked about this a little bit. Because so Walmart gets a lot of criticism for being absolutely obsessed with profit. Okay, and so the reason why Walmart supported healthcare mandates, why Walmart supported an increase in the minimum wage, I'm pretty sure it's not because their executives woke up with a progressive social conscience one morning. It's like, what we really ought to do is pay more and have more of this wonderful stuff. So some of you might be familiar with the phenomenon called the Baptist and bootleggers phenomenon. I don't know if that's been mentioned yet this week, but it's a term that was coined by Bruce Yandel to describe the coalition that supported prohibition. Okay, so the people who supported prohibition were, quote, the Baptists, so conservative evangelicals who thought that alcohol was inherently evil, or something to that effect, and thought, thou shalt not drink would be a good law to have on the books because it would increase the moral quality of the people. Who else supported prohibition? The bootleggers. The bootleggers supported prohibition because they got rich. Okay? Al Capone was probably Prohibition's biggest fan because he got fantastically wealthy running bootleg liquor into different places. So in this kind of situation, the Baptists would be people who say, well, it would be nice if poor people were richer, and I would love to see poor people get richer. I'd like to see everybody earn higher wages and have great stuff and all of this. The bootleggers in these kinds of situations are the firms that are going to be able to earn higher profits as a result of getting the regulators on their side. Okay. 4.
What responsibility do firms have for negative externalities like carbon emissions?
Okay, what responsibility do firms have for negative externalities like carbon emissions? Okay, looking around the room, I don't see Walter Block. Okay, because Walter actually gives a handful of great lectures on property rights and externalities. So I'm gonna punt to that and to my lecture on environmental and resource economics that I'll give, I think, tomorrow, and just basically say if you transform someone else's property against their will or without their permission, then they have a right to seek relief. Okay. So a hand here-ish. 1, 2. Okay. Last question. Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to make a comment on the idea that the regulations lend themselves to larger banks and larger corporations. And certainly from personal experience, I worked at a large investment bank in New York, and I worked with smaller ones. And I can absolutely speak to the fact that in terms of compliance issues and regulatory issues that you have to go through, I clearly spent any time doing that in a large investment bank. And working in a small investment bank, a considerable part of my day spent doing that. So I am inherently a more inefficient employee in terms of marketing value added to the bank, and therefore that lends itself why big top 5 banks dominating the finance industry. Like why aren't small banks doing that? So it absolutely lends itself to that.
All right, I'll close. Okay, that's a very good point, and I think it can be summarized in one final claim that I will close with. That's related both to environmental economics and to the theory of the firm. Okay, so we're going to have cap and trade for carbon emissions and things like that. A hypothesis that I've seen offered that I think is very, very plausible is that this is going to work out to the explicit benefit of firms like Goldman Sachs and ExxonMobil. things like that. That's a prediction that I will make that I hope proves wrong, but we can talk about that in greater detail tomorrow.